Flash content is animated based upon a system of frames in the timeline. In this lesson, we'll explore the basics of frames and see how to apply labels to frames to further organize our content. So here we can see that we have a basic document open up, and within this document, in the timeline, we have one layer by default, and also one blank keyframe by default. We can tell that this is a blank keyframe because it's white, it has a circle in it. The circle indicates that it's a keyframe instead of just a regular frame. If it was simply a regular frame, we would have no circle, it would just be totally white. Keyframes in Flash are frames which have some sort of a shift in whatever object is on that frame. So if I were to have an object here, and I change any of its properties, I could change that in a new keyframe, and then all of the frames between these two keyframes would adjust accordingly. So I'm going to change this layer name to frames. And it's very important to name any of your layers so that you can better organize your content. I just created a new layer by clicking on this button right here, and I'm going to call this layer labels. If you're using labels within your Flash project, I would suggest a few things. One is creating a layer specifically for labels, and the other is actually locking down that layer, just so you don't place any extra content within these frames. So let's talk about the basics of frames. So say I wanted my animation to be 50 frames in length. I could highlight frame 50 here, and going up to the menu, Insert, Timeline, Frame. What this is going to do is actually insert frames up to and including the frame that I have selected, which is frame 50. So we can see here, now I have a beginning keyframe on each of these layers, a sequence of individual basic frames, which ends in this little ending frame. So these little symbols here, you've got this open circle, that indicates a keyframe, and then this open square indicates the end of a frame sequence. So say I want to actually include another keyframe somewhere, say around frame 30. I could do that through the menu up here by going to Insert, Timeline, Keyframe. And right now, if I choose Keyframe, you can see that it actually inserts a blank keyframe. If I actually had something on the stage, it would convert that to a keyframe including the object. So to see this in action, I'm going to undo. And on this keyframe here, I'm going to simply draw out an object, right? So now that I actually have an object, this keyframe shows up as a little black dot instead of a unfilled dot. Also, since this object spans across this entire set of frames, we also see that the frames themselves take on a gray color. So let's go back to frame 30, and I'm going to insert a keyframe, but this time I'm going to actually do it from the right-click menu. So right-clicking on the keyframe, I can choose Insert Keyframe or Insert Blank Keyframe. So if I choose Insert Keyframe, we can see that we have another keyframe right here. So we have two sequences of frames. This one here, and then this one. So if I go in and say, use the selection tool to move this object upon the keyframe placed at frame 30, it will be moved for that entire frame sequence. However, my original frame sequence from 1 to 29, the object actually still exists in its original location. So here we have the basics of animation. Notice that there aren't any tweens going on, so nothing is happening to fill in from the point where the object exists here to the point that it exists right here. So we would use something like a shape tween or a motion tween or a classic tween in order to fill in these frames with animation. So on to labels. For labels, this actually is a really good way of organizing content in a sort of visual way on our timeline, and we can also access frame labels from ActionScript to inform the playhead to jump to a certain point. To insert a frame label, simply select the frame, and then go up to the Properties Inspector for that frame. And for name, under the label category, we just say, whatever we want to call this label. So I'm just calling this starting. And we can see here that we've got a little flag on that keyframe, which shows us that, hey, we have a label right here. And if we have enough room in terms of the span of frames, it'll spell out the actual frame label. If I want to include one right here, I would have to insert a blank keyframe and then go up and give it a new label name. So let's call this one adjust. So now I have two labels, and they align on these keyframes, but they don't necessarily have to. In fact, I can even select and then click and drag any of these keyframes around to adjust them if I need to. One last thing I'm going to show is the ability to insert blank keyframes in order to stop a sequence of frames. So here I'm selecting frame 45, I'll right click, and I'll insert a blank keyframe. So we can see when I do that, the object actually disappears because it's blank. There's nothing else on there. So I could use this to insert more objects if I wanted to, or simply have some dead space between animated sequences. So this has been a lesson demonstrating the use of frames across the timeline and frame labels in Flash Professional CS6.